January 1945. Eastern Europe lies under a sky the color of frozen iron. Snow drifts across an abandoned road where a column of displaced civilians presses forward in silence. Among them, a small boy, no more than 6, walks alone. His coat is too large, the buttons mismatched, the sleeves torn by weeks of cold wind. He carries no luggage. Only a wooden tag hangs from his neck, its ink smudged by frost and tears. Artillery rumbles in the distance, echoing across the empty fields. Each concussion sends a tremor through the crowd, but the boy barely reacts. His steps are slow, automatic, as if each footfall is an act of remembering how to move. A soldier passes him, glances down, hesitates a moment, then moves on. No one knows the child's name. No one knows where he came from. And in the chaos of collapsing front lines, few have the means or the time to ask. But scenes like this were not rare. They were multiplying, spreading across continents, becoming one of the war's least recorded tragedies. A tragedy whose roots reach back into the war's earliest days and into the world that created these orphans. When war erupted in September 1939, Europe entered a period of upheaval that tore apart not just borders, but families. The first waves of orphans appeared almost immediately. In Poland, Luftwaffe bombings destroyed entire residential blocks, leaving children wandering in the ruins of cities like Warsaw and Lodz. Relief workers recorded scenes of toddlers sitting beside the bodies of parents they couldn't yet understand were gone. Many were gathered by local aid groups, many more were not. By 1940, the phenomenon was spreading across the continent. Mass evacuations, from London to Birmingham, from Helsinki to rural Sweden, from German cities threatened by Allied air raids, saved countless young lives, but also separated hundreds of thousands of children from their parents. Some were displaced only temporarily. Others never saw their families again. Lost records, chaotic transport routes, and sudden attacks meant that even well-organized programs produced unintended orphans. On the Eastern Front, the situation escalated dramatically. German and Soviet operations cut through villages with devastating speed, leaving behind shattered communities. Entire regions in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states experienced population loss at a scale not seen in generations.
As fighting intensified, children often became the last survivors of families destroyed by reprisals, deportations, or starvation during prolonged sieges like Leningrad. Local authorities, overwhelmed and under-equipped, struggled to identify and shelter the increasing numbers of abandoned or unaccompanied minors. Some children were absorbed into orphanages. Others were taken in by passing units, relief groups, or civilians. But tens of thousands simply disappeared into the vast movement of refugees fleeing advancing armies. Amid this rising tide of loss, each country attempted to respond, some through state programs, others through improvised measures born out of desperation. And these early attempts formed the groundwork for how millions of vulnerable children would be treated as the war expanded. As the conflict widened, the scale of displacement reached levels no pre-war institution had been designed to handle. By 1941, with Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, entire populations were uprooted in weeks. Soviet authorities evacuated more than 1 million children eastward to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Many survived the journey. Many others succumbed to hunger, illness, or exposure before reaching safety. Those who made it were registered in hastily established children's homes, some functional, others overwhelmed from the moment they opened their doors. In occupied Poland and parts of Eastern Europe, children deemed racially suitable were taken from their families and sent to the Reich for Germanization. Their names were changed, their languages suppressed, their identities erased. After the war, many were impossible to locate or identify, becoming lost not through death or displacement, but through deliberate bureaucratic absorption. In Western Europe, Allied bombings produced large numbers of civilian casualties, and with them, growing orphan populations in cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Paris. Although government childcare systems attempted to manage the influx, wartime shortages meant that orphanages became overcrowded, understaffed, and often unable to maintain adequate records. Without documentation, even children who survived the war sometimes had no traceable path back to relatives. Across Asia, particularly in China, Japan's military campaigns left hundreds of thousands of children unaccompanied. Many survived in urban ruins, reliant on extended family networks or ad hoc communities of displaced civilians.
Others followed retreating armies, hoping to find food or protection. By 1943, international relief groups were aware that a global orphan crisis was unfolding, but few possessed the reach to intervene effectively. And so, with the world overwhelmed, the experience of these children would be shaped by a range of forces: human, tactical, political, and moral. For a child separated from family during the war, survival often began with confusion rather than fear. Many were too young to understand what had happened or why adults around them moved with such urgency. Relief workers from Britain to the Soviet Union described the same expression: a blank, stunned stillness. These children drifted through train stations, supply depots, and burned-out villages, clutching a blanket, a tin cup, or nothing at all. Hunger shaped their days, silence shaped their nights. Some found themselves protected by strangers who took temporary responsibility for them. Others were passed from unit to unit, their identities deteriorating with every transfer. In many cases, no one wrote down their names. And as fighting intensified, the distance between a child's last known home and their present location could grow to hundreds of kilometers, making reunion nearly impossible. Their individual stories varied, but the experience repeated across continents, forming a shared human reality behind a global crisis, a reality shaped by forces far larger than themselves. Behind each lost child was a series of broken logistical systems. Evacuations, though designed to protect civilians, often fragmented families. Britain's Operation Pied Piper moved more than 1 million children out of targeted cities within days. But the speed meant that registries were incomplete and many siblings were separated. On the Eastern Front, tactical withdrawals by both German and Soviet forces repeatedly displaced entire populations in a matter of hours. Armies were focused on mobility, not documentation, and children who became separated during retreats or sudden bombardments were rarely recorded. Refugee trains, overloaded beyond capacity, sometimes left with children aboard whose parents had been unable to reach the station in time. Aid organizations attempted to track movements, but frontline conditions shifted too rapidly for systematic record-keeping. Each failed record, each unmarked transfer, widened the gap between families. The tactical priorities of war had no space for administrative precision, and in that gap, countless children disappeared into anonymity, another casualty of military momentum. The technology of the 1930s and 40s was not built for global humanitarian tracking. Identification relied on paper cards, handwritten lists, and local registries, all vulnerable to destruction. A single air raid could wipe out thousands of names. When orphanages were overrun or relocated, files were often abandoned or burned. In occupied Eastern Europe, German authorities used meticulous record systems for political control, but even these were fragmented across agencies. Many children deported for forced labor or Germanization were assigned new identities, severing any documentation of their origins. In the Soviet Union, massive wartime evacuations produced mountains of paperwork, much of it never centralized or preserved. The absence of standardized international procedures meant that even when organizations like the Red Cross tried to locate families, their success depended entirely on whether the child's name had survived in some local ledger. For many, no such ledger existed. Their identities were effectively erased by the simple failure of wartime bureaucracy, a failure that shaped their fate more decisively than any battlefield. In every nation at war, leadership decisions directly influenced the fate of displaced children. Government ministries, military commands, and occupation authorities were forced to choose between strategic necessity and humanitarian responsibility. British officials prioritized rapid evacuation over complete documentation, accepting the administrative risks as the Luftwaffe intensified attacks. In the Soviet Union, directives to relocate industrial workers and military personnel often overshadowed the needs of the children who accompanied them, or who were left behind when parents were mobilized. German occupation authorities enforced racial policies that separated children not by circumstance but by ideology. In countries under occupation, local leaders had limited power and often operated under coercion, able to provide only fragmented support. Each policy decision, an evacuation order, a deportation directive, a restriction on movement, created conditions in which families could be split permanently. And once made, these policies were rarely reversible. Leadership choices, whether humanitarian or ruthless, became structural forces that defined the lives of thousands of children who had no voice in their own fate. For children trapped under military occupation, the enemy varied by geography, ideology, and circumstance. In German-occupied Eastern Europe, crackdowns on resistance, mass reprisals, and forced relocations shattered family structures. Parents disappeared to labor camps or prisons, leaving children to wander through territories where survival depended on invisibility. In territories occupied by Japan, similar patterns emerged. Scorched earth campaigns, reprisals for guerrilla activity, and urban devastation created thousands of unaccompanied minors. Occupying forces often viewed local civilians with suspicion, seeing children not as victims but as potential informants or burdens. Relief efforts were minimal or strictly controlled. Identification of displaced children was rarely a priority, and in many cases, occupation authorities actively destroyed local records. This environment made reunification nearly impossible. Even when hostilities shifted or occupiers withdrew, the children left behind carried the long-term consequences of months or years spent in zones where military objectives eclipsed all humanitarian considerations. The vast displacement of children during World War II raised moral and legal dilemmas that had no immediate solutions. Who bore responsibility for a child with no documentation? Which nation claimed a child who crossed multiple borders during wartime? Could a child forcibly removed for ideological reasons ever be restored to their original identity? International law lagged behind these realities. Adoption frameworks varied widely between countries, and wartime transfers often occurred without legal oversight. Some children found safety with families who cared for them deeply but lacked any formal guardianship papers. After 1945, many of these arrangements were challenged as governments attempted to reclaim missing children. Others entered institutional care where staff struggled to balance compassion with overwhelming caseloads. The war had created a generation of minors whose legal identities were fragmented or missing altogether. These unresolved questions would follow them for decades and would come to define the turning points that reshaped their lives as the war reached its climax. The forces established by these angles converged sharply as the war entered its final, most chaotic phase, a phase where the fate of countless lost children would be decided in moments of crisis. In 1944 and 1945, as the Axis fronts collapsed, the crisis surrounding lost and orphaned children reached a breaking point. The final months of the war produced some of the most chaotic mass movements of civilians in modern history. Armies retreated under pressure, territories changed hands in days, and refugee routes shifted unpredictably. In this turmoil, the fragile structures that had kept displaced children identifiable, even imperfectly, began to fall apart entirely. One turning point came with the German retreat from Eastern Europe. As the Red Army advanced through Poland, East Prussia, and the Baltics, millions fled westward. Between the bombardment of villages, the freezing winter of 1944-45, and the overcrowded evacuation columns, countless children were separated from parents in minutes that proved irreversible. Aid workers later noted that many children found after the Battle of East Prussia had no memory of their own names. Another decisive moment occurred in the collapse of the concentration and forced labor camp systems. When camps were evacuated, children were moved on foot or packed into trains with little oversight. Some were left behind in abandoned sites discovered by Allied troops, malnourished and unable to speak. Others died during forced marches so disorganized that survivors could barely recount which roads they had taken. Liberation brought safety, but not clarity. Many young survivors could not identify their origins, nationalities, or remaining family members. The sinking of refugee-laden ships in the Baltic Sea created another tragic turning point. Vessels like the Wilhelm Gustloff, overloaded with civilians including families and unaccompanied minors, were torpedoed during evacuations. Survivors often lost the last relatives they had, emerging from the freezing water as the sole living members of their families. By spring 1945, Allied forces entering liberated territories encountered children everywhere. Alone in farmhouses, hidden in cellars, wandering near roads where front lines had passed only hours earlier. Their presence forced commanders, relief units, and civilians to confront a humanitarian emergency that no army had planned for and no government could easily resolve.
And within this escalating crisis, individual choices and rapid military advances shaped the most critical moments that determined whether a child remained lost or was finally found. As the war's final offensives unfolded, the convergence of military urgency and humanitarian need revealed how fragile a child's fate could be. During the Allied push into Western Europe in late 1944, towns liberated from German occupation reported children emerging from basements, barns, and makeshift shelters within hours of the first troops entering. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, some carried scraps of paper with names written by parents who had vanished during deportations. Others had no information at all. Military police units were forced to improvise, establishing temporary collection points where children were fed, registered, and kept safe until civilian authorities could take over. But with fighting moving rapidly, these improvised stations often closed as quickly as they opened. In Central Europe, the situation was even more complex. As Soviet forces approached Berlin, thousands of children fled westward or were left behind in the ruins of bombed neighborhoods. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 exposed an entire city's worth of displaced minors. Soviet soldiers, German civilians, and the remaining infrastructure struggled to manage the sudden appearance of children who had survived by hiding in cellars, subway tunnels, or the rubble of collapsed buildings. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, Yugoslavia's violent civil war and the shifting control between partisan, Axis, and collaborator forces created a patchwork of regions where children survived only because local groups, often with minimal resources, hid them at great personal risk. Liberation brought relative safety, but not necessarily reunification. Many families had been destroyed and records lost in burned town halls or abandoned administrative centers. Across Asia, similar turning points occurred. As Japanese forces retreated in China and Southeast Asia, children displaced years earlier resurfaced in cities devastated by bombardment or famine. Relief workers noted that many had survived through informal networks of strangers who shared food despite having little themselves.
By mid-1945, these simultaneous breakthroughs across continents marked the moment when the war's violence began to yield to efforts at recovery, a transition that would define the aftermath and the struggle to account for millions of missing young lives. When the fighting stopped in 1945, the world discovered a humanitarian landscape altered beyond recognition. Relief organizations, armies, and newly restored governments faced a task without precedent: identifying, sheltering, and repatriating children whose names, origins, and families were often unknown. The numbers were overwhelming. Across Europe alone, millions of minors had been displaced at some point during the conflict, and hundreds of thousands had no clear documentation. The Allied armies worked alongside the Red Cross, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and local authorities to gather children into temporary shelters. These facilities, though vital, were quickly overfilled.
In Germany and Poland, intake centers recorded children who spoke languages they themselves could not identify. Some had survived ghettos or camps. Others had lived through bombardments, evacuations, or long periods of hiding. Many were malnourished, sick, or emotionally withdrawn. One of the most urgent tasks was determining nationality. Children taken for Germanization had often been given new names, taught a new language, and stripped of all identifying items. Reversing this process required patient interviews, psychological assessment, and cooperation between governments still emerging from occupation. Asia faced similar challenges. In China, Indonesia, and Burma, repatriation was complicated by collapsed infrastructure and ongoing conflict in certain regions. Many children had crossed multiple wartime zones, making their origins difficult to confirm. Each child represented both a life saved and a challenge unresolved, a reminder that victory on the battlefield did not automatically restore the lives shattered in its wake. In the years immediately following the war, the struggle to reconstruct these children's identities became one of the longest and most delicate humanitarian efforts of the 20th century. International tracing services were established, relying on surviving documents, eyewitness testimony, and the memories of children who were often too young to recall their own pasts. Progress was slow. For many, the only clues were regional accents, fragments of lullabies, or faint recollections of landmarks from towns that no longer existed. Some children were eventually reunited with relatives, aunts, uncles, or older siblings who had survived in distant countries. Others were claimed by governments seeking to restore populations devastated by occupation or genocide. But thousands remained in a legal limbo. Adoption agencies stepped in, providing stable homes, but often at the cost of severing any remaining connection to birthplace or culture. In several nations, debates emerged over whether children who had been raised for years in foster families should be returned to distant surviving relatives or allowed to remain with those who had cared for them throughout the war. By the late 1940s, the world began to move on, rebuilding cities, reopening schools, restoring borders. Yet for many of the lost children, the post-war years brought a quieter struggle to form an identity from fragments and to live in societies eager to rebuild but not always ready to confront the depth of wartime loss. These unresolved stories formed the emotional legacy that would shape the final reflection on what it meant to be a child in the deadliest conflict in human history. Decades later, the image of a child walking alone through snow or rubble remains one of the most haunting symbols of World War II. These children, often invisible in grand narratives of strategy and victory, embodied the human cost that statistics and maps cannot fully convey. They remind us that war's destruction extends beyond soldiers and cities. It reaches into the smallest and most vulnerable lives, shaping identities, families, and futures in ways that endure long after treaties are signed. The story of the lost children challenges our understanding of responsibility. It exposes the limits of leadership, the fragility of systems, and the unintended consequences of decisions made under extreme pressure. It also highlights extraordinary acts of compassion, the strangers, soldiers, and relief workers who risked everything to feed, shelter, and protect children who were not their own. Every small act of care became a lifeline, proving that humanity can persist even in the midst of overwhelming chaos. Yet these stories also raise enduring questions about memory and justice. How many were never traced, never reunited, and never acknowledged in the official histories of nations? How many lived their entire lives carrying fragments of names, places, and families lost to conflict? Their experiences form a quiet testament to resilience, a reminder that the human consequences of war ripple far beyond the battlefield, shaping generations in ways history often struggles to record. And in remembering them, we confront not only the past, but the enduring responsibility to protect the most vulnerable whenever the world descends into violence.